Lydia Charles and Rickey Thigpen. Lydia has made the South her home since 2008. In 2019, she joined Mississippi Department of Archives and History to do program planning and grant administration. She's been in several positions in Washington, cultural tourism, D.C., and the National Museum of African American History and Culture Save Our African American Treasures initiative. She works a lot with our local communities, and Lydia is actually on our state board as a representative right now. Rickey Thigpen is the CVB director, I guess probably a different executive director in Jackson, Mississippi, and I've gotten the privilege to get to know Rickey serving on the Mississippi Tourism Association board. He has multiple management positions within the hospitality industry for the past 33 years. Since 2019, he has served as president and CEO of Visit Jackson. Rickey is a member of Destination International, where he serves as a board member and on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. He is a member of the U.S. Travel Association Board of Directors, MTA's Executive Board, and an officer of the Capital Area Tourism Association and the Downtown Jackson Partners Advisory Board. In 2019, he was named MTA's Member of the Year, and he has appeared in Black Meetings and Tourism Magazine, and in 2020 received its coveted Apex Award. What I think is just so unique is the blending of Main Street representation and historic preservation and archives and the tourism industry. So I hope that you guys are as excited about that and learn a lot in this session. Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's all right. Yeah. Well, again, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this amazing organization and the critical work that you do. Lydia and I are kind of tag team here because Lydia has a wealth of knowledge in the Main Street environment, and I've been in tourism for about 33 years. So it's amazing how, and what I've learned during this pandemic is we typically have operated in all these silos. And now that we need each other because our resources are limited, right? And plus we do some of the same work. So this is a perfect example of how we can really support each other, share resources, and everybody. I just believe that, what they say, rising tides lift all boats. And so that's just what we're gonna do today, I think. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself first. I got into the destination management organization very untraditionally. So I started in 1987, and I was the first computer guy. There was a System 36 stacked against the wall that was probably like somebody bought for like $25,000, and nobody knew what to do with it. So back then, there was no PCs, so you had to have a programmer to make things work, and I was just fortunate enough to get that job. But been a president CEO since about 2019, and right after getting into the diversity space, right after the George Floyd came to work, I was lost, and I think with my hands. So I just started writing, and I'm very fortunate to have an amazing team back at Visit Jackson, and they encouraged me just to write. One of those people's in the room, Kim, wave your hand, Kim, and just write. And I let it out, and Kim cleaned it up. We actually did an open letter, and it received so much positive attention across the United States. And it really, because a lot of times, and most times, I was the only guy in the tourism space that looked like me. The only one. In fact, there are 13 African Americans that hold my position in the United States of America. Out of 210, 13. So that's really what propelled me to really become recommitted to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so then I joined those 13 leaders across the country, and we did a letter to the tourism industry, because sometimes the hospitality industry can be very unhospitable, not only well. And so that's what kind of, again, got me into the space. And so let Lydia tell you a little bit about her journey.
Sure. Can you hear me all? Well, as Jennifer mentioned and as Rickey mentioned, I've been literally with Main Street in some capacity at a national level or a city level or a town level since 9/11. And so we're talking about national events bringing us to this work. And one of the reasons why I started to work with that as I was working at Smithsonian American History And we laid off a lot of people because we weren't having tourists come to town. And our numbers were based on how many people were coming through. And I was living in a historic neighborhood, Adams Morgan, and the Main Street program was just starting in DC. And I walked in the door, and like Rickey said, fair or unfair, Main Street can typically be a white organization. And that's a challenge, which is why we're really wonderful to be part of this panel. So I walked in, not knowing anything about Main Street, but I had museum work. This man, Larry Levine, changed me from a biologist to a cultural studies major. That's his book. I highly recommend it. Because what Main Street is, it's looking at the culture of shopping, it's looking at the cultures of downtown, it's looking how to make it welcoming to people from a variety of backgrounds, so that they'll come and help your town. So that's what I'm gonna be talking about today, because I do have that Main Street background, and as Rickey said, we're just gonna be tag teaming.
All right, so really this diversity, equity, and inclusion piece really is all under the umbrella of social justice. And especially, again, speared after the George Floyd incident this summer, there were a lot of demonstrations. This actually happens to be a picture at the governor's mansion in Jackson. I was so proud because a lot of these Black Lives Matter demonstrations got to be violent, unruly. And everyone in Mississippi, they were held all across the state. And I know everybody's not from Mississippi, but I get a chance to, I'm a tourism guy, so I have to be proud of Mississippi all the time. All of them were peaceful. And that's something that we say in Jackson, at Visit Jackson. A lot of horrible things happen in Jackson, Mississippi around the civil rights movement. But we think that a lot of those things that happen really change the culture and the consciousness of this country. And if Mississippi can host rallies, and that crowd is hard to see, but there were all races, all genders, all religions, all sexual orientations. There were people from across the cross-section of the state of Mississippi together in a peaceful, if Mississippi can send that signal to the country, it can happen anywhere. Because it doesn't take, everybody, whether you're a historian or not, you know the history of Mississippi, and specifically its race relations. So that was something that made me very, very proud to be a Mississippian. And so I'll tell you another incident that I had experienced. I'm a member of an organization, and I was the state president. And Reverend Pinckney, the minister that was killed in Charleston, was also a member of that organization. And I got a chance to be a guest, to represent the state of Mississippi at his funeral services. It's our college fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha. And when I walked outside from the services, there was a pre-service on that Friday evening, this young lady had that sign. She said, "Please come take a picture with me." Inherently, people are so kind. We went to go eat that night. This gentleman, happens to be a white gentleman, just said, "We got to pay the bill." They said, "Your bill's paid." And this gentleman walked up and said, "I paid the bill. I'm so sorry that you had to come to Charleston for this." People are inherently kind. But this is the sign. She said, "Love will always be stronger than hate." I mean, again, we just have to, it only takes a few bad apples to spoil a bunch, right? So I am encouraged, and somebody asked me, well, when is all this Black Lives Matter and this social justice stuff gonna be over? And my answer is, and my commitment is, when change comes. It's not going to go away, so we've got to deal with it. And typically, in the South, and we're all Southerners, we do a much better job than the rest of the country of being vocal, having uncomfortable conversations, being honest with each other. Because people from the East Coast and the West Coast would say, we don't have racism. No, you do. You're just not brave enough to talk about it. And so I applaud us for at least having uncomfortable, because we're not gonna always agree, but sometimes we have to have uncomfortable discussions with each other about this. So we're not gonna all agree in this room about some things we're gonna talk about today, but beginning to have the discussions is critical.
And actually, Rickey, can I say something to that?
Sure.
Can you all hear me? I had mentioned earlier about how I started with Main Street. You might know the name Kennedy Smith. She was one of the first. And so Kennedy and I would have conversations. Although I'm not from the South, my people are. And so I was asking those hard questions that Rickey is saying as a child raised by a Southern woman, saying, you're making some assumptions about the South. You're making some assumptions about this small downtown. You're making assumptions about this neighborhood without asking the neighborhood. And that's part of DEI as well. And we're going to talk about that more, of getting the word out, having those conversations. And when we get to the 4 points, I'll kind of point out how in those different areas you might be able to address some of these issues.
Awesome. So there's something called babes. All of us have babes. Our babes are identified by the time that we are 13 years old. That's why it's so important as we raise children to teach them, 13 years old. So that's your values, your assumptions, your beliefs, and your expectations. And that's an initiative that we have going on right now, even in tourism, because we're trying to, it's very difficult to tell a 45-year-old something new, because they've got their heels dug in, right? But, a 9-year-old is pliable. That's why we have to protect them, but also expose them. So I was born in Jackson, Mississippi. My parents were educators in the Delta, Rolling Fork, Mississippi. Right after I was about 4 or 5 years old, we moved to Langston, Oklahoma. There's a small historically black college university called Langston University. My father became the chair of the music department there. He was the band director for forever, almost 45 years or so. And so that really kind of frames who I am as a person, because I grew up in a household, and when I found out once I went to college, a little different than, and I went to a historically black college university. I went to college with Jerry Rice at Mississippi Valley State University. But I didn't know that everybody didn't grow up in a household with their mom and their dad, because that was my normal. But what I found out once I got to college is I was in the minority, especially at a HBCU. Both my parents were educators. That's another weirdness thing about me. So education, bringing a B home in our house was not necessarily a great thing. There's a lot of explaining to do with a B. And I got a chance to be, exposed culturally, because with your dad being a musician, being in the symphony and those kind of things, I play the oboe and the English horn today. I still do that now. Again, so that made me a weird person, and I had to learn. But it took me I went to college to understand that my experience was not everybody's experience. And as we talk about diversity, that's one aspect of diversity. My babes were completely different than some of my classmates, some of my counterparts, and I had to understand that. So I'm gonna let Lydia talk about her babes a little bit.
Well, as I mentioned, raised by a Southern woman. The other thing is, because we have the Iowa background of Main Street, my father is Norwegian, looks like Santa Claus, raised in Iowa. My mother's from St. Martinville, Louisiana. So both rural districts, right? Completely different. My brothers and I would make the joke. When we were in Iowa, we were the only black people within a 30-mile radius. And when we were in St. Martinville, my dad was the only white man for a 30-mile radius. And so in terms of our beliefs, assumptions, expectations, they vary. As you can tell from my accent, I was not raised in the South. I go up north. I went to school in Boston, and I asked the first question, where are your people from? So a Southern California accent, New England, asking where your people are from. That doesn't fall into many babes. So when you're thinking about how you're programming for Main Street, think about these different things. As I said, we're talk about in the 4 points. But also know what yours are and what you're bringing to the table, and how challenge yourself to expand that, because in doing that, you're also challenge your community and your Main Street in a very positive way. So just think about these things when you're going to your organization meeting, organization committee, which is my favorite. You might just want to ask, what are the babes of your organization? You probably have mission statements, but what is that? So yeah.
So I'm just floored and impressed with your vitality, design, promotion, organization. And when, Lydia and I got a chance to meet about a month and a half ago or so. And then I've been just reading a lot about Main Street. And so again, I applaud you for the work you do, but it's amazing how congruent the work that we do in tourism and the work you do at Main Street. In my mind, it's a part of tourism, how they fit together so perfectly. So Lydia's gonna talk a little bit about your 4 points and how diversity, equity, and inclusion really feeds into it. So we at Visit Jackson, there are 25 destination management organizations in the state of Mississippi. Our goal is to be economic generators. That is our goal. And so the economic vitality, we take about $3.5 million a year, and we magically turn it into about $50 million in economic impact. And so that's a pretty good return on investment. So same as Main Street, design, creating a sense of place is so important, especially now we've learned during COVID and we're dealing with our workforce development issues. We've got some of the most amazing colleges and universities in the South. In the last census that lost population. You know why? They don't necessarily go for the job that has the biggest paycheck. Because they get the money they need, they get from us. Because they're going to take vacations on the weekend. They're going to go to New Orleans, place to hang out, and then they'll figure out how to pay the car note when they get back. That's just how we taught them to think. We've got to, if you build it, they will come. But if you build it, if they're going to come, you've got to promote it. You got to tell somebody about it. And then the organization, again, I read a book recently, Culture Eats Strategy for Lunch. How powerful is that? So no matter how you have, the organization aligned, if the people who are working together are not respected, feel valued, and again, this new generation, these millennials, the first thing that's most important to them is not the money. They want to be valued, they want to be listened to, all those things. So that is just, from a tourism vantage point, that's something that we're really having to embrace. And for those of us who have been in the industry a while and gray hair or no hair, we hired a lady a couple years ago who did amazing work, and she put her ear pods in her ear every day when she sat down at her desk. And I thought that was the most disrespectful thing in the world. Because she comes to work and the first thing she is, and she just puts her ear pods in and she works. And she works. And then finally I went to a conference and said, so what? She don't want to hear you talk. She's getting her job done. She doesn't have a problem, you have the problem. Because you think there's something wrong with somebody. What's wrong with her being happy at work and being ultra productive? So some of us who are a little bit older, that's diversity. That age is a major piece. The age demographic of how we think and how we have to let those that work with us and for us thrive.
And that's a great segue because, as I said, I'm a cultural studies. That's what I do, right? So I'm going to give a little bit of history about Main Street, which you might already know, but it affects how people interact with downtown. And the reason I decided to write these notes was I was at an earlier meeting today, or a panel, and one of the panelists said that the beauty of downtown is that you assume it's one identity of downtown. And so let's work on that. Not always the case. When I was talking about being at my father's house or childhood home in Callender, Iowa, that's one identity for downtown Callender, Iowa, not for my brothers and I. Same with St. Martinville, Louisiana. My dad would go downtown, there's Santa Claus in the square. That's kind of where it was. So taking the idea that there's one identity for your downtown, talk about what your organization is looking for, what that identity is. And back to history, one of the reasons why malls really started to come into play in the 70s is that it allowed for generic spaces for people to shop who were not accepted in their downtowns. If I'm a Black woman in 1975 and I go downtown in Callender, Iowa, I might not be able to try on a dress, 65, and I may not be able to try on a dress. Or in Jackson, Mississippi, in certain areas, or different neighborhoods. But if I go to the mall, I'm accepted. I can wear my dress. So that's part of one of the reasons why downtowns also and malls started to really thrive. In the 80s, similar thing with the big boxes, but that had to do with price points. I am not really known, and I can buy it. And it's the same thing that I could buy at a different place in a different town. I'm gonna have the same exact product. So downtown started to shift because of economics, but also because of inclusion or exclusion. That's the history of downtown for many folks. There are certain places in St. Martinville, I would never cross the square as a child because that was the white part of town. And we know this is our history. So one of the things that's beautiful about Main Street is we're breaking that down, which is wonderful because we want to shop. It's also ironic. I don't like shopping. I hate shopping. I put these pants on. I made these pants 3 years ago. I don't like shopping. But when you're looking at what's in your downtown mix, economic vitality, when I was with Main Street, was economic restructuring. What's the business mix of your Main Street corridor? Even in the shop specific. So with economic vitality, think about brands. I'm not a brands person. My nieces and nephews are. If you're talking with one of your businesses who has a clothing store, have one brand possibly that's not gonna break their bottom line, but a brand that they know that younger people might come to. So it could be age, it could be ethnicity, something that is attractive, that's online, that's at the mall, but they're gonna walk downtown and get it because they know it's gonna be at that store. Back to price points, we know that downtown that's a challenge. But as your organizations are thinking, what are the price points? Where can you make adjustments? So vitality and diversity is not just about ethnicity and genders, it's also about what you can afford. Excuse me. And the culture of shopping. We know that it's a destination. My grandmother would go to the mall every Saturday. Didn't matter. Just to go shopping, she'd have to buy something. She's 98, when she died at 90 years old. We saw all these shoes, like, Grandma, you didn't go anywhere. But every Saturday, she went shopping and she bought something. So what is the culture of shopping that you're creating in your downtown? Is it something that's every Saturday? Is it something Thursday nights? What is the culture of shopping? Because at the end of the day, Main Street is about putting dollars into your communities, right? It's about tax base. So create a culture of shopping that's inviting, and it's incremental, right? It's not that everybody's gonna buy every Thursday night. But when they have an idea of buying something, they might come in on that Thursday night because they know it's there. So what's the culture of shopping for your commercial district? Design, access. That also happened with the malls, making sure ADA regulations are open. I took my uncle, who was in a wheelchair, to a restaurant in the French Quarter. We couldn't get him upstairs. It was 3 stories up, and it was 2 lanes, alumni something, because they couldn't get a wheelchair into the old building. So make sure you have access. Visual aids, older folks, younger folks, where are they looking? Where are your sight lines? Children, if there's something that you know you're gonna have a lot of families, having their sight lines. Oh, mommy, look, I wanna go there. And the parents are like, wait, what? Oh, but it's the child's now directing the culture of shopping. Lighting, essential for safety, daytime, nighttime. And there's this new thing, now talk about feeling old. I was in Cleveland, and they have these wonderful, and I think Greenwood has it too, speakers in the ground when you're walking on walking paths, which are fantastic. Be mindful of what's playing on those during different times of the day. Because I was in Cleveland walking at 6 a.m. and Led Zeppelin was playing. I'm like, I like classic rock, don't get me wrong. But at 6 o'clock in the morning, no. If you're trying to create a theme, Greenwood does a lot of blues because you're in the Delta. So think about different times of the day. If you're trying to bring families in, something to think about in terms of design. As I said, organization is my favorite. What time are the board meetings? We know that this is a volunteer organization. If you want to get different people coming in at different times of the day and kind of make that a more inclusive and diverse board, think about the times of the day that you have your meetings. How are things communicated? Even though I have to be online because it's 2021, I like things written. Find out where your community is. What do the businesses, how do they like to be communicated to, and vice versa. So how are things communicated? Keep it simple. Keep it simple. Main Street is the antithesis to the corporate consultants. You all are grassroots. Keep it simple. Every time I go to a meeting, how simple is this? Can your grandmother read this as well as your 5-year-old child and myself? Keep it simple. Shoppers, in terms of diversity and inclusion, we're looking at shoppers, getting them in, but as I mentioned, it's the organization as well as the shoppers. If your board is diverse, that's going to change how things are organized on the street, in the shopping corridor. If you have a DEI or diversity, what does DE stand for again? I'm getting bad in terms of alphabets. It's diversity,
Equity, inclusion.
Thank you. See if your organization has a statement in it or put it in there so that everybody who comes to the board knows that this is something that's going to be in the forefront of your mind with everything that you're creating. And then finally, promotion. Language is key. Not so much, as Rickey has said, the South is different than the North, but I was working with the Main Street program, and so I'm in the mayor's office overseeing all these different Main Street programs. And the Main Street was so excited. It's in a Black neighborhood. It's called U Street. If you've been to Washington, D.C., it's where Ben's Chili Bowl is. Historic district. It's the fairest street of Washington, D.C. And they did this whole promotion for Christmas. And they're presenting it. It was great. And they called it Shine. And this was a white group. Now, I don't know if you know what shine can mean for Black folks. It's a derogatory term historically. It's like Sambo. It could be equal to that. And I had to talk them through and say, before you choose language, talk with different people, because you don't know who you might offend. And they already printed everything, so we had to, it was heartbreaking. Sponsors. Who are your sponsors? Think about that too. Utilities are always a nice sponsor to have or approach because everybody uses utilities, and they want to demonstrate that they are donating and sponsoring inclusive organizations. And once again, access. Who can read your materials? If you have different languages in your neighborhood or in your community, what is that access? And you don't have to print everything in multi-languages, but maybe if you have an on-site resource, having something that can direct or have one person or having some different languages that are there. And events are kind of self-explanatory too. Mixture of music, mixture of foods, thinking about who you're inviting. And it doesn't have to be different all the time, but just show a variety of events that you're being mindful. I think the last thing I'll say in terms of the 4 points, just be mindful. Don't just assume you know the answer. Just don't assume what's going to work in one community is going to work in another. Think about things. Ask questions of each of you. What has worked in this community is great. Okay, let's try to bring that and bring it to organization first, bring it to promotion first, and talk it through. So just be mindful.
I'll share something really quickly. Also, don't make assumptions. So you look at me, Black guy, not real dark complected. I have freckles. That doesn't happen too often. Too often? Because I happen to know, not get a chance to meet him. But my great grandfather happened to be Caucasian. Okay? So, but also, now that may be a little bit more obvious, but until June of this year, I was also legally deaf. I have a titanium bone now in my left ear, so I can hear. So you can't look at somebody all the time and tell exactly what's going on. So being inclusive, establishing those characteristics that will help remove barriers to bring the Main Street program closer together are very, very important, because you can't always look at somebody and tell exactly what the customer is dealing with. Because I was deaf until June 17th when I had surgery. So that's just an example. So a couple of things that Lydia and I wanted to talk about really quickly, because we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, but let's talk about what those words mean, because they're all different. All right, so diversity includes all the ways in which people differ, encompassing the different characteristics that make one individual or group of people different from others. That is very important. That is diversity. If you had a visual, this is kind of a visual of what diversity might look like. Different religions and cultures and colors and races and genders and that's diversity. And then inclusion. That's the act of creating environments in which individuals or groups can feel welcome, respected, supported, and valued to fully participate. Sure.
And I've talked about being incremental. Before I joined the mayor's office to work on Main Street, I called a Main Street director because I'd just been laid off. I had time. I'm living in a historic district. And I said, I would love to volunteer. And he said, are you available Tuesday nights? I said, no. Click. So I called back. It was not like click, as I'm saying. It was just like, oh, well, we don't have time for you. Good luck. Then another time I called, well, can you do this on Thursdays? Take time. Continue to reach out to people who've said no to you. Because I did the reverse of that. I kept asking because I wanted to do that. I wanted to volunteer. But if you know somebody that would be essential and great to your Main Street, ask them over and over. Find out what would feed them in your Main Street organization. Find out what gaps that you might have so inclusion happens. But it's not going to happen immediately necessarily, but it will take time.
Thank you. Equity is a fair treatment, access, and opportunity and advancement for all people, while at the same time striving to identify and eliminate barriers that prevent the full participation of some groups. So again, we just reviewed that diversity, inclusion, and equity are very, very different aspects. And there's an example that I use. So this is reality. Life is not always fair. That's the reality. That's reality. Some of us are tall. So I tell everybody, I identify as skinny. Okay, all right? And then there's equality. And then you can put programs in place that create some sense of equity. But what happens when you put liberation in place? Just remove the barriers. Just remove the barriers. So, and it's not always, this is not easy. This is not easy work. It is work that we can successfully have a good outcome. But this is the example I use in tourism with diversity, inclusion, and equity. Diversity is being allowed to ride the tour bus. Inclusion is being allowed to drive the tour bus. But equity is owning the tour bus and being supported by the industry. So again, diversity, inclusion, and equity.
And when Rickey showed me this example, I said, remember it was economic revitalization, or I don't remember what it was, economic vitality. We could only work in commercial corridors when I was with Main Street, and now I see things kind of going into residential areas. That bus is your commercial corridor. So you could apply these 3 different items with this principle, but think of the bus as your commercial corridor. Being allowed to ride and walk and shop in the commercial corridor. That's diversity, inclusion. Being allowed to drive, so back to organization. Who's working with your Main Street program? Who's putting on the events? Who's creating the materials that you're using for your Main Street? And then equity. Who are owning the businesses in your commercial corridor? Who's shopping in your commercial corridor? Who's performing in your commercial corridor? So it applies, the exact same thing applies the bus is your commercial corridor.
Thank you. All right, so why is diversity, inclusion, and equity important? In the tourism space, in the downtown space, in the Main Street space, why is it important? Power and success. That's that economic vitality. When you bring more people to the table, where they have different worldviews, different vantage points, the propensity for success is heightened. Let me tell you a quick story. So I told you I'm a band geek. I'm still a 56-year-old band geek now. Because when you grow in a house with a band director, that's what happens. But anybody know what Drum Corps International is? Anybody heard of that? So I participated in Drum Corps as a young guy. As the computer guy, every year, my vacation was to go to Drum Corps International. That's all I can afford. That's about me and my college buddies met up at Drum Corps, wherever it was, and we spent 3-4 days watching marching bands. And I came back and told the sales director, I said, we ought to bring that to Jackson, Mississippi. And they said, what is that? And I explained it, and they said, nobody would want to come do that. I said, yeah, people want to do that. So we went one year. They went with me, some of the sales team. Well, in the late 90s, guess what? Jackson, Mississippi hosted Drum Corps International at Mississippi Veterans Memorial Stadium. 85,000 people per day for 1 week. People stayed in Jackson, Meridian, the Delta, because we didn't have enough hotel rooms, right? And for one time, the whole community understood tourism because grocery stores, they cook their own food. They have the food trucks come in, so they would go in and buy. If you got to feed 150 kids a day that are 18, 19, and 20 years old, that's a lot of food, right? And you have 50 drum corps, so why are you using so much ice? I said, because we're in Jackson, Mississippi, and it's July. Having to, build props and fix props and repaint. And then the bus maintenance companies, everybody finally said, we love tourism. They didn't know what it was before, but it was our first event that we brought to the capital city. The banks couldn't keep quarters. Do you know why? Because you know what drum corps students do? And back then, coin laundries. We had to talk to the coin laundry owners and stay open all night long because they perform and practice all day. And at night, you got to have clean clothes. It was an opportunity for them to finally understand how. When you bring somebody to the table who has a different experience than you do, the opportunity for success is heightened.
And that's exactly what I was saying. You need a Rickey on your organization committee or on your board who can bring one thing to your neighborhood or to your community that hasn't been seen before. Just find that one Rickey, find that one thing that you haven't even considered. And he'll help you do it. I mean, that's the other thing. Don't be the worker bee. Find also the worker bee. Because you could just say, oh, let's bring a jazz fest to blah, blah, blah. Okay, who's going to do that? How's it going to be paid for? What Rickey just described, he understood it, he had attended it, and he knew how to make it successful.
So again, when you have the diversity of power, it impacts problem solving. I didn't know anything about convention sales, but I knew all about drum corps stuff. And we had an advantage over some of our competitors because they had these people doing the bid that had never held an instrument in their lives. Then status quo. When you bring people to different vantage point, you bring new ideas, new concepts. Ronald Reagan said, do you know what status quo is? It's insanity to do the same thing that you failed on the same way. And adaptability. You have to do things again You can't say it won't work. You have to say, how can I make it work? How do I get the yes? So I always tell our team, at Jackson, we don't have a statue. We don't have an arch. We don't have a lot of the other things that a lot of major capital cities have. But we got the nicest people in the world. And if you don't think that sells, walk down the street in New York and ask somebody how to get to Macy's. They will step on you. So we never take those small wins, those advantages, those small assets that you have in your community for granted. Because if you package it correctly, they can represent big wins. Again, diversity of power. And there's there's something a little bit later, I'll go ahead and share it with you now. Diversity of thought. That's another thing we don't talk about very often. Again, we kind of stuck in this race and gender, and that's great, but diversity is a full diaspora of characteristics. And diversity of thought is one that we are probably the most guilty of. Because in the South, we're doing a much better job of race and gender, in my opinion. But, if somebody doesn't think like we think, I don't want to work with them. But that's where the power is, diversity of thought. And so this is an example that I use in the tourism space. So again, Lydia talked about identifying talent. So these are the same people. Not really, but in my weird mind, they're the same people. A 19-year-old bellman works really hard in the hotel space for 25 years. Guess what? He becomes a general manager. So that's another thing. So as you identify people to work in the Main Street programming, create opportunities for growth, for elevation into the C-suite. We got to do that, because otherwise we're going to, that's another way to lose talent, quick, fast, and in a hurry. Because these young folk, they're not going to, I worked in the tourism industry for 30 years before becoming president and CEO. These young folk don't do that. They don't do that. They get out of college and they think within the next 3 years, right?
Before you go, don't go to the next slide yet, because I know what the next slide is. Think of your cottage industries, who are in the residents, who are already a catering business. And maybe not having them cook on your main street, but having them do a cooking demonstration. Identify where your business is already in your community, and how do you bring that presence to your commercial corridor, have the face of your neighborhood. Because this is corporate, which is great, and he became the CEO. So how do you have somebody who's cooking and baking cookies to have a business? There was something in the another about cutting shears, the hair cutting shears. What was that in Starkville? That's here. Yeah, but there's some young men who were cutting hair, connected with Mississippi State, with engineers to create these cutting shears that didn't overheat. And now they have a business and an industry that is making those products here in Starkville. So identify where these talents are.
Same thing here, same example. But I want to share this real quick. A lot of times in our workspace, our kids want to be what we are. A lot of doctors' kids want to be what? Doctors. And a lot of lawyer kids want to be lawyers, and school teachers want to be school teachers. Not all the time, but you remember in the movie Help, that character was Minnie Jackson? That's Minnie's daughter beside her. So we need to just be very careful about putting glass ceilings in place. And we need to create succession planning and blinders, right? And because Minnie is a great maid, no, we don't just keep Minnie in that maid position forever because she's such a great maid. She may need to be the executive housekeeper to train other housekeepers. So just really quickly, we're almost out of time. And so we're gonna skip. I wanted to talk about some best practices. So Lydia and I kind of came up with a couple of things. And I'm gonna go ahead and bring them all in, because we have to be very intentional in this space. And so we have to lead from the top. If you're the leader, if you don't actively demonstrate pushing diversity, equity, inclusion, it's not gonna happen. It's just not gonna happen.
organizational committee for item 2.
Build an infrastructure that supports diversity. Put things in place. Again, it's got to be very intentional. Succession planning. Put something in writing. If you start working at the storefront or cleaning, there's an opportunity for you to get in management.
And also, back to different times of the day. If you are cleaning in the downtown, maybe you're seeing your downtown in a different way. That's also inclusive. You have no idea who is during the 24-hour cycle, 7 days a week. That's something that's also inclusive. Whoa. Okay.
Also, network intensely, and I'm going to challenge you to network outside of your traditional industry. Right now at Visit Jackson, we're getting ready to launch a program to work with third graders. Why? Third graders don't have any money. They're not tourists, but they impact tourists. Because most of us don't go to McDonald's because it's the best hamburger in the world. We go to McDonald's because the person in the back seat says go to McDonald's, right? So utilize that strategy. So identify more people and network. What now?
I think six we've been talking about with the different colleges and connections for there.
Yep. Also, support, again, just ultimately support diversity and build it into your business plan.
I would connect 8 with 2. Those are very 2 simple things you can go back to your organization committee with. And it doesn't have to be large targets. It could be a 1% increase. It could be bringing one person who's never come to the main street to shop at a different store. Be simple. Simple is key. Very simple.
When identifying talent, sometimes you have to look elsewhere than the places you traditionally look for. If you only looking for people to work that go to church with you, that's going to limit your diversity. So throw that net again wider.
We're dealing with mostly volunteer, and that's what your board is. So management incentives, just throw a party once in a while. If you're a Main Street on the board, and they might have a percentage discount at one of your favorite restaurants or the stores, that would be more in line with how we kind of work with Main Street.
Create and identify some diversity training. One of our new asks, all employees that work with me now have to go to diversity training, including me, because I don't know everything. I don't want to be, if we invite international visitors to our destination, I don't want to be offensive because some people in different cultures do things differently than we do in this country. So that's just an example.
And item 12, I know that the National Main Street Center, I'm sure, has resources for you all to tap into. And if they don't have something that you think is needed, I mean, we're dealing in a different community. We're dealing in the South. Ask them to help create that. They have the funding to hire the person who can create the resources. Demand it. I mean, you all are designated Main Streets. Go to the national, go to the state, find out where the business cases are so that you can help articulate for your Main Street organization.
And don't be afraid to track your progress and measure your process. Rome wasn't built in a day, and this is not going to happen overnight. This is an ongoing process. I said, so again, commit to diversity, equity, inclusion, and it is not something that you do, okay, check, done, never deal with it again. It is something that has to be ongoing, all right? One of the best practices that I saw in religion is spelled wrong, Lydia, I didn't change it. I thought about it a few minutes ago. But one thing that all of the Convention and Business Bureaus did in the world was we took a DEI pledge. All of the CEOs signed a document to do some of those best practices we just talked about. That's what you call being intentional. When you have to sign something, and in our boardroom, we've got a diversity statement on plexiglass on the wall. How that's in my face every day. So if I don't practice what I preach, my board looks at me and says, "You're not doing that." Or how are we doing on that thing that's on the wall? Just an example.
One thing that I'm going to offer, I do have, although I'm no longer with Main Street here, I'm on the board and I work with Mississippi Department of Archives and History, but I'm going to give you my card if you'd like to just kind of walk through some things since I've been doing this around the country. Because this is Rickey, just to be continued. This is an ongoing process in a industry that is needing this to be successful for downtowns.
And this to be continued. Again, this discussion can't stop. COVID has changed how we do business, right? And guess what? There's gonna be something, hopefully not another global pandemic. There's gonna be something else that changes how we think, how we do business. So we have to make sure we're fluid, dedicated to being successful and being able to adapt as we move forward. That's it. Thank you.